The year was 1944, and the small Belgian city of Mons stood frozen in a peculiar kind of terror. For 4 long years, the Nazi occupation had turned everyday life into a choreographed dance of survival, where one wrong step, one misplaced word, could mean disappearance into the night. But on a cold September morning, something far worse than occupation was about to descend upon this city of 60,000 souls. Hidden in a bunker 15 miles away, a German artillery commander had just received orders that would reduce Mons to rubble within hours. The guns were loaded, the coordinates were set, and the only thing standing between this city and total annihilation was a 23-year-old woman sitting in a cramped telephone exchange room, her hands trembling as she connected the call that would seal Mons's fate. Her name was Marie Lecomte, and she was about to make a mistake that would save more lives than any deliberate act of heroism ever could. This is the story they never taught you in history class, the story of how one woman's error in translation stopped an artillery barrage that military historians believe would have killed over 10,000 civilians in a single afternoon. Marie Lecomte was nobody special, at least not by the standards of war. She had grown up in Mons, the daughter of a baker and a seamstress, and her life before the war had been painted in the soft colors of predictability. She worked at the Central Telephone Exchange, a job that required her to speak both French and German, connecting calls between the occupying forces and their command centers across Belgium. It was tedious work, the kind that made your ears ring and your fingers ache from operating the heavy switchboard plugs hour after hour. The Germans had kept her employed precisely because she was unremarkable, because she seemed too simple, too ordinary to be dangerous. They never suspected that this quiet girl with the nervous smile understood far more German than she let on, that she had been secretly passing information to the Belgian resistance for over a year. But on this particular morning, Marie was exhausted beyond measure, having worked a double shift because another operator had fallen ill. Her eyes burned, her head throbbed, and the constant stream of German military jargon had begun to blur into an incomprehensible fog. The telephone exchange building itself was a relic from another era, a 3-story stone structure near the city center that had somehow survived the initial invasion. Its walls were thick enough to muffle the sound of the outside world, creating a strange bubble of isolated urgency where every ring of the telephone felt like a small emergency. Marie shared the cramped second-floor room with 2 other operators, both older women who had learned to keep their heads down and their mouths shut. The room smelled of burnt coffee and old cigarette smoke, and the only decoration was a faded map of Belgium, pinned to the wall, marked with the locations of various German command posts. The switchboard itself was a monster of cables and plugs, a mechanical beast that demanded constant attention and split-second precision. One wrong connection, one misrouted call, and the consequences could be severe, though never as severe as what was about to unfold on this September morning. The call came through at exactly 9:47 in the morning, a priority line from Oberstleutnant Heinrich Müller, the artillery commander stationed at the forward position near Maubeuge. Marie recognized his voice immediately, that clipped, impatient tone that suggested he viewed everyone beneath his rank as barely human. He was calling the regional command center in Brussels, and his message was clear and catastrophic. Allied forces were advancing faster than anticipated, and rather than risk the Americans capturing Mons, with its strategic railway junction intact, High Command had authorized a complete artillery bombardment of the city center. The attack was scheduled to begin at 1100 hours, giving the remaining German troops just over an hour to evacuate their positions. Müller's voice crackled through the old copper wires, rattling off coordinates and firing sequences with mechanical precision, and Marie felt her blood turn to ice as she understood the full weight of what she was hearing. This was not a tactical strike on military targets. This was the deliberate destruction of her home, the annihilation of everyone she had ever known. But exhaustion does strange things to the human mind, and in that moment, as Marie frantically scribbled down the coordinates Müller was dictating, her brain simply refused to process the numbers correctly. The commander was speaking too fast, his Bavarian accent was too thick, and the static on the line turned his sharp consonants into muddy approximations. When he said Koordinaten 352, coordinates 352, her exhausted mind heard Koordinaten 325, Coordinates 325. It was a simple transposition, the kind of mistake that happens 1,000 times a day in telephone exchanges across the world, except this mistake redirected 48 howitzer guns away from the densely populated city center and toward an empty field 7 miles to the northwest. Marie connected Müller to Brussels, relayed what she believed were the correct coordinates to the command center, and then sat back in her chair, her hands shaking so badly she could barely light the cigarette she desperately needed. She had no idea what she had just done, no comprehension that her error had just saved Mons from becoming another footnote in the long list of European cities destroyed in the final months of World War II. At exactly 1100 hours, the German artillery opened fire with a thunderous roar that could be heard for miles. 48 howitzers unleashed their fury on the coordinates Marie had provided, shells screaming through the autumn sky at over 2,000 feet per second. But instead of raining down on the narrow medieval streets of Mons, on the Grand Place where families still tried to maintain some semblance of normal life, on the schools and hospitals and shops that made up the fragile infrastructure of occupied civilian existence, the shells landed in an empty pasture, northwest of the city. They churned the earth into a moonscape of craters. They shredded a few unfortunate cows that had been grazing there, and they accomplished absolutely nothing of military value. Back in his bunker, Oberstleutnant Müller stared at his maps in confusion, unable to understand why the spotter planes were reporting no damage to the city itself. The railway junction stood intact, the bridges were still standing, and the residential districts showed no signs of the devastation his artillery should have caused. Someone, somewhere in the chain of command, had made a catastrophic error. The confusion in the German command structure was immediate and absolute. Müller's frantic radio calls to Brussels demanded explanations that nobody could provide. How had an entire artillery barrage missed its target by such a significant margin? The mathematics didn't make sense. The trajectory calculations had been triple-checked, and yet the shells had landed in completely the wrong location. In Brussels, staff officers scrambled through their notes, comparing the coordinates they had received with the maps spread across their tables. Everything matched their records, which meant the error had occurred somewhere earlier in the chain, possibly during the initial telephone transmission. But with Allied forces closing in and German lines collapsing across Belgium, there was no time for a formal investigation. Müller was ordered to stand down to conserve his remaining ammunition for the actual retreat and to forget about Mons entirely. The city, through sheer accident, had been granted a reprieve that nobody in command had authorized or even understood. Marie Lecomte spent that entire day in a state of numb confusion, going through the mechanical motions of connecting calls while her mind struggled to process what had happened. She had heard the distant thunder of artillery, had felt the building shake with the concussions of high explosives detonating somewhere beyond the city limits, but Mons itself remained untouched. The German troops began their evacuation in chaotic disorder, trucks and half-tracks racing through the streets as officers screamed orders that nobody seemed to follow. By late afternoon, advance scouts from the American 2nd Armored Division were entering the outskirts of Mons, meeting only scattered resistance from rearguard units too disorganized to mount any serious defense. Marie watched from her window as the first American tanks rolled past the telephone exchange, their crews looking almost disappointed at the lack of battle damage. This was supposed to have been a contested city, a strategic objective that would require house-to-house fighting to secure. But instead, they found a population that was frightened, hungry, and remarkably intact. It wasn't until 3 days later that Marie began to understand what she had done. A Belgian resistance fighter named Thomas Rousseau, a man who had been coordinating with Allied intelligence, came to the telephone exchange looking for her specifically. He had been monitoring German communications and had pieced together enough information to realize that an artillery strike had been ordered against Mons, but had somehow gone catastrophically wrong. Thomas had obtained copies of the German firing coordinates from a captured command post, and when he compared them to what Allied reconnaissance had observed, the discrepancy was obvious and enormous. Someone had transposed the numbers, had sent 48 howitzers firing at empty farmland, instead of a city center packed with civilians. Thomas needed to know if Marie had been the operator on duty that morning, if she had handled the call from the artillery commander, and if she remembered anything unusual about the transmission. Marie's first instinct was to deny everything, to protect herself from potential accusations of sabotage that could bring retribution against her family even after liberation. But as Thomas explained the mathematics of what had happened, as he showed her the maps with the intended target marked in red and the actual impact zone marked in blue, the reality crashed over her like a physical weight. Her exhaustion, her simple human error, had saved somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 lives according to Allied estimates of expected civilian casualties. The dense neighborhoods around the railway junction, the hospital on Rue de Nîmes, the primary school where 300 children had been attending classes that morning, all would have been obliterated if the shells had landed where Müller intended. Marie had made a mistake, nothing more than a tired woman transposing two numbers during a routine call, and that mistake had accomplished what months of resistance operations and Allied bombing campaigns had failed to achieve. It had preserved Mons intact for liberation. But Thomas brought troubling news as well. The German command, even in retreat, was beginning to investigate the failed bombardment. Several officers suspected deliberate sabotage rather than simple error, and they were compiling lists of everyone who had touched the communication chain that morning. Marie's name was on that list, and if the Germans managed to capture her before their final withdrawal from Belgium, she would face immediate execution as a saboteur regardless of whether her actions had been intentional or accidental. The Nazis were in no mood for nuance or investigation. They were losing the war and looking for scapegoats, and a telephone operator who had allegedly redirected an artillery strike would serve as a perfect example. Thomas urged Marie to go into hiding immediately, to disappear into the chaos of liberation until the German presence in Belgium was completely eliminated. For the next 6 days, Marie Lecomte would not exist on any official record. Marie vanished into the underground network that had sustained the Belgian resistance throughout the occupation, moving from safe house to safe house as American forces systematically cleared the remaining German positions from the region. She stayed in attics and basements, in the hidden rooms behind false walls that had sheltered Jews and Allied airmen and resistance fighters for 4 long years. The irony was not lost on her that she was now hiding from the same enemy she had inadvertently defeated, that her accidental heroism had marked her for death more surely than any deliberate act of sabotage ever could have. The resistance kept her moving every 2 or 3 days, never allowing her to stay in one location long enough for patterns to emerge or for neighbors to start asking questions. She lived on stale bread and ersatz coffee, slept on thin mattresses laid across cold wooden floors, and spent her days in suffocating silence while the war's final act played out in the streets above her head. The German retreat from Belgium was brutal and chaotic, a disorganized stampede of desperate men who knew they were racing toward either capture or death. In their panic and rage, they took revenge on anyone suspected of aiding the Allied advance or undermining their operations. Telephone operators across liberated territories became particular targets because the Germans had finally realized that their communication networks had been compromised for months, that seemingly loyal Belgian workers had been passing information to the resistance and occasionally sabotaging critical calls. In the town of Charleroi, 30 miles south of Mons, 3 telephone operators were executed in the town square on charges of espionage. In Namur, 2 more were dragged from their homes and shot. The message was clear and terrifying. Collaboration with the enemy, even suspected collaboration, would be met with immediate and public execution. Marie listened to these stories in her various hiding places, whispered by resistance members who brought her food and news, and she understood with perfect clarity that her transposed numbers had become a death sentence. What made Marie's situation particularly dangerous was that she genuinely could not prove her innocence, because she was, in a technical sense, not innocent at all. She had been passing information to the resistance for over a year, had been deliberately misrouting calls and delaying connections to disrupt German operations. Her error with the artillery coordinates had been accidental, born of exhaustion rather than intent, but her record of actual sabotage would make that distinction meaningless to a German military court. If captured, she would be executed not for what she had accidentally done to save Mons, but for what she had deliberately done during the previous 12 months. The resistance understood this complexity and debated among themselves whether Marie was truly in danger or simply being paranoid. Some argued that the Germans were too busy retreating to bother with individual telephone operators, that the executions in other cities had been random acts of terror rather than targeted investigations. Others insisted that the failed bombardment of Mons was too significant to ignore, that someone in German intelligence was absolutely building a case against whoever had botched those coordinates. The answer came on September 20th, exactly 11 days after the artillery barrage had missed its mark. A Gestapo unit, one of the last still operating in Belgium, raided the telephone exchange in Mons with a specific arrest warrant bearing Marie's name. They interrogated the other operators at gunpoint, demanding to know where Marie Leconte had gone and when she had last been seen. The two older women who worked alongside her claimed ignorance, insisted that Marie had simply stopped showing up for work after the liberation and that nobody knew her whereabouts. The Gestapo didn't believe them, but had no time for extended interrogation. They posted guards at Marie's family home, at her parents' bakery, at every location she was known to frequent. The trap was set, and it would remain in place until either Marie surfaced or the German forces completed their withdrawal from Belgium. Thomas Rousseau brought this news to Marie's current safe house, a damp cellar beneath a butcher shop, and his face was grave with implications. The Germans were hunting her specifically, which meant someone high in the command structure had confirmed that the coordinate error originated from the Mons telephone exchange and had traced it directly to her. The question now was not whether Marie had saved Mons, that much was undeniable, but whether she would survive long enough to see the city she had rescued return to genuine peace. The American advance had slowed, bogged down by supply issues, and stiffening German resistance along the approaches to the German border. It could be weeks before the last Nazi soldiers were driven from Belgium, weeks during which Marie would have to remain hidden while Gestapo agents actively searched for her. The resistance had experience keeping people alive in occupied territory, but they had never tried to hide someone while simultaneously defending them from a targeted manhunt during a chaotic military withdrawal. Marie's accidental heroism had created a unique and terrifying problem. She was wanted by an enemy that was losing the war, but had just enough time and resources left to kill her before their final defeat. The resistance network made a decision that would have seemed insane under any other circumstances. They would move Marie out of Mons entirely and transport her to the countryside where German patrols were thinner and Allied control was more established. The plan was dangerous because it required Marie to travel through multiple checkpoints and roadblocks during the most volatile phase of the occupation's collapse. Roads that had been safe in the morning could be swarming with retreating German troops by afternoon, and the papers the resistance could forge were good, but not perfect. One suspicious guard, one thorough inspection, and Marie would be arrested on the spot. But staying in Mons was no longer an option, because the Gestapo was systematically searching every building within a 2-mile radius of the telephone exchange, using informants and collaborators to identify possible hiding locations. 3 safe houses had already been compromised, their occupants arrested or forced to flee. The net was tightening, and Thomas Rousseau understood that they had perhaps 48 hours before the Gestapo's search pattern reached the butcher shop where Marie currently hid. The journey began at 3 in the morning on September 22nd, with Marie hidden beneath potato sacks in the back of a farmer's truck. Her papers identified her as Isabelle Durant, a farmhand from a village near the French border who was traveling to help with the harvest. The story was plausible enough because thousands of workers were moving through the countryside at that time, trying to salvage what they could of the year's crops before winter arrived. The farmer driving the truck, an older man named Claude who had been running supplies for the resistance since 1941, knew every back road and farm track in the region. He avoided the main highways where German convoys still moved in long, desperate columns toward the Rhine. Instead, he took Marie through a maze of rural routes, past abandoned checkpoints and burned-out vehicles, through villages that were either celebrating liberation or mourning their dead. The journey that should have taken 3 hours stretched into 7 because they had to stop repeatedly, hiding the truck in barns or behind hedgerows whenever German patrols appeared on the horizon. Marie spent most of that journey in a state of surreal detachment, watching the Belgian countryside roll past, through gaps in the burlap sacks. She saw American tanks positioned in fields, their crews eating rations and smoking cigarettes. She saw German prisoners being marched along the roadside, young men who looked more relieved than defeated. She saw farmhouses with white sheets hanging from their windows, improvised flags of surrender that became more common the further they traveled from Mons. The world was transforming around her. The occupation was ending in real time, and yet she remained trapped in a strange liminal space where she was simultaneously a hero and a fugitive. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. She had saved thousands of lives through a simple mistake, and now she was running for her own life because of that same mistake. No military medal or public recognition awaited her, because acknowledging her role would mean acknowledging the error, and errors during wartime were either quietly buried or loudly punished, depending on their consequences. They reached the safe house near the village of Roeschin just after 10 in the morning. An isolated farmhouse surrounded by fields that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The location was perfect for surveillance because anyone approaching could be seen from miles away, which made it both secure and terrifying in equal measure. The farm was run by a widow named Marguerite Fontaine, who had lost her husband and 2 sons to German labor camps and had been sheltering resistance members ever since. Her house had hidden rooms built into the barn and a cellar entrance concealed beneath the kitchen floor. Marguerite welcomed Marie with the weary efficiency of someone who had done this too many times, showing her the hiding spots and explaining the emergency signals without any emotional preamble. If German soldiers approached, Marie was to hide in the cellar and remain silent no matter what happened above. If American forces arrived, she was to stay hidden until Marguerite gave the all-clear signal. Trust no uniform, trust no accent. Trust only Marguerite's word, because in the chaos of liberation, anyone could be wearing anyone else's clothes. For the next 6 days, Marie lived in a state of suspended animation, helping Marguerite with farm chores during the day and hiding in the cellar at night. The routine was mind-numbing in its simplicity, designed to make her invisible and forgettable. She milked cows, collected eggs, mended fences, and spoke to no one except Marguerite. The old woman rarely discussed the war or asked about Marie's past, understanding that some silences were safer than conversation. But on the 3rd night, as they sat together eating a sparse dinner of bread and preserved vegetables, Marguerite asked the question that had been weighing on both their minds. She wanted to know if Marie truly understood what she had done, if she grasped the magnitude of the lives saved by her transposed numbers. Marie admitted that she was struggling with the concept that 8 or 10,000 people was a number too large to comprehend emotionally. Marguerite nodded slowly and then said something that would stay with Marie for the rest of her life. Every single one of those people would wake up tomorrow because of her, would eat breakfast and hug their children and complain about the weather, and none of them would ever know her name. That was the purest form of heroism, the kind that required no recognition because the act itself was its own complete reward. The false peace of the farmhouse shattered on September 28th, when a German reconnaissance patrol appeared on the eastern horizon, 3 vehicles moving slowly along the dirt road that led past Marguerite's property. Marie was in the barn when Marguerite's urgent whistle pierced the morning air, the prearranged signal that meant immediate danger and no time for questions. She dropped the bucket of chicken feed she had been carrying and sprinted toward the house, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might burst through her ribs. The cellar entrance was already open, the concealed trapdoor lifted to reveal the narrow wooden stairs descending into darkness. Marie practically fell down those stairs in her haste, and Marguerite slammed the door shut above her, dragging the kitchen table back into position to hide the seams in the floorboards. The cellar was pitch black and smelled of damp earth and old potatoes, and Marie crouched in the corner with her hand pressed against her mouth to muffle her breathing. Above her head, she could hear boots on the wooden floor, multiple sets of them, and voices speaking in German with the clipped authority of soldiers who expected immediate obedience. The interrogation was brief but terrifying in its implications. The patrol commander wanted to know if Marguerite had seen any suspicious individuals in the area, particularly young women traveling alone or hiding on farms. They had intelligence suggesting that a wanted saboteur had fled Mons and was hiding somewhere in the rural districts between the city and the French border. Marguerite played her role perfectly, the confused old widow who knew nothing about saboteurs or suspicious women, who was simply trying to keep her farm running, despite the chaos of war. She offered the soldiers water and apologized for having nothing better to give them, a calculated gesture of hospitality that implied cooperation and transparency. The commander accepted her story, but warned her that harboring enemies of the Reich would result in the farm being burned and Marguerite being executed. They would be conducting regular patrols through the area, and any unusual activity should be reported immediately to German authorities. Then they were gone, their vehicles churning up dust as they continued their sweep of the countryside, and Marie remained frozen in the cellar for another 20 minutes until Marguerite finally opened the trap door and told her it was safe to emerge. That encounter changed everything, because it confirmed that the Gestapo's hunt for Marie had expanded beyond Mons and had become a regional operation. They were conducting systematic searches of farms and villages, questioning locals and threatening anyone who might be sheltering the telephone operator who had sabotaged the artillery strike. The fact that they described her as a saboteur rather than acknowledging the possibility of an honest mistake told Marie everything she needed to know about her fate, if captured. The Germans had decided on their narrative. Marie Lecomte was a dangerous resistance operative who had deliberately redirected an artillery barrage, and they would execute her publicly as an example to anyone else who might consider similar acts. The truth that she had been exhausted and had simply transposed two numbers during a stressful call was irrelevant to their purposes. They needed a villain to blame for their failure at Mons, and Marie had been selected for that role. Thomas Rousseau arrived at the farm that evening with news that made the situation even more desperate. The Gestapo had arrested Marie's parents in Mons and were holding them as leverage to force her surrender. The message delivered to the resistance network was explicit. If Marie turned herself in within 48 hours, her parents would be released unharmed. If she continued to hide, they would be executed as accomplices to sabotage. It was psychological warfare of the cruelest kind, exploiting the bonds of family to break the will of someone who had committed no intentional crime. Thomas watched Marie's face as he delivered this news, waiting for her decision, and she could see in his eyes that he expected her to surrender. That was what any decent daughter would do, sacrifice herself to save her parents from German revenge. But Marguerite interrupted before Marie could speak, her voice sharp with an anger that had been building for 4 years of occupation. She pointed out what everyone seemed to be forgetting. If Marie surrendered, the Germans would execute all 3 of them anyway, because they needed to make an example, needed to show that sabotage would not be tolerated even in the final days of their retreat. Turning herself in would not save her parents, it would simply add her name to theirs on the execution order. The resistance debated the situation through the night, weighing impossible choices with no good outcomes. Some argued for a rescue attempt, storming whatever building held Marie's parents and freeing them by force. Others insisted this would be suicide, that the Gestapo would have anticipated such a move and would have stationed guards specifically to ambush any rescue party. A third faction suggested negotiation, using intermediaries to convince the Germans that Marie's error had been accidental and therefore did not warrant such extreme measures. But everyone knew that negotiation was pointless because the Germans were beyond reason in these final weeks, driven by fury and desperation to inflict maximum damage before their inevitable defeat. The real question, the one nobody wanted to ask directly, was whether Marie's accidental salvation of Mons was worth the lives of 3 people, herself and her 2 parents. If the answer was yes, then she should continue hiding and accept that her family would pay the price for her mistake. If the answer was no, then she should surrender and hope the Germans showed mercy they had never demonstrated before. Marie listened to these arguments in silence, understanding that whatever decision she made would haunt her for the rest of her life. Marie made her decision at dawn on September 29th, but it was not the decision anyone expected. She would neither surrender nor remain passively hidden while her parents faced execution. Instead, she demanded that the resistance help her do something that seemed impossible, break her parents out of Gestapo custody before the 48-hour deadline expired. Thomas initially dismissed the idea as suicidal fantasy, explaining that the Gestapo held prisoners in the old garrison building near the Mons railway station, a fortress-like structure with stone walls 3 feet thick and guards posted at every entrance. Even with Allied forces controlling most of the city, the Germans still maintained a defensive perimeter around their remaining strongholds, and any assault would result in a bloodbath. But Marie had spent her entire life in Mons and knew things about that building that the resistance had forgotten. Before the war, it had been a postal sorting facility, and there was a service tunnel that connected the basement to the railway platform 200 yards away. The tunnel had been built in 1927 to facilitate mail transfers between trains and the sorting facility, and it had been sealed during the occupation, but probably not demolished, because the Germans rarely bothered destroying infrastructure they might eventually need. The plan that emerged from this knowledge was desperate and required perfect timing, but it was theoretically possible. A small team would enter through the railway tunnel, while American artillery created a diversion on the opposite side of the German perimeter. The confusion would give them perhaps 10 minutes to locate Marie's parents, get them out through the tunnel, and disappear into the chaos of the railway yards, where resistance members could hide them among the crowds of displaced persons and refugees. It was the kind of operation that relied more on audacity than careful planning, and Thomas hated every aspect of it because too many things could go wrong. But he also understood that Marie would attempt this rescue with or without resistance support, and her chances of survival improved dramatically if experienced fighters accompanied her. He assembled a team of 6 people, 4 men who had been conducting sabotage operations since 1942, 1 woman who had worked as a nurse and could provide medical support, and Marie herself, who insisted on being part of the rescue despite having no combat training or experience with violence. They spent 18 hours preparing for an operation that would last less than 15 minutes. The resistance contacted American artillery units and arranged for a bombardment of German positions on the northern edge of Mons, scheduled for exactly 8 o'clock on the evening of September 30th. The Americans were initially reluctant to fire on a city they had just liberated, but when Thomas explained that civilians were being held hostage and would be executed within hours, they agreed to provide supporting fire aimed at German defensive positions away from residential areas. The resistance team assembled their weapons, mostly British Sten guns and grenades that had been airdropped months earlier, and reviewed maps of the garrison building based on Marie's descriptions and pre-war architectural plans. The railway tunnel entrance was located behind a false wall in an abandoned warehouse, and resistance members spent the day quietly removing the bricks that sealed it, revealing a dark passage that smelled of mold and standing water. Marie stood at the tunnel entrance as the sun began to set, understanding that she was about to cross a threshold from which there would be no return. Up until this moment, she had been a victim of circumstances, a woman hiding from consequences of an accidental mistake. But the moment she entered that tunnel with a weapon in her hands, she would become exactly what the Germans accused her of being: a saboteur, a fighter, someone who had chosen violence rather than accepting fate. The team entered the tunnel at 7:45, giving themselves 15 minutes to navigate the 200-yard passage before the artillery barrage began. The tunnel was worse than anyone had anticipated, partially collapsed in several places and flooded with knee-deep water that was ice-cold and stank of sewage. They moved in single file, using shielded flashlights that provided barely enough illumination to avoid tripping over debris. Marie was positioned in the middle of the group, protected by fighters in front and behind, and she focused on putting one foot in front of the other, rather than thinking about what they were about to attempt. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, each step taking them deeper into enemy territory, closer to a confrontation that would almost certainly end in gunfire and death. She could hear her own breathing echoing off the brick walls, could feel her heart pounding in her chest, and she wondered if this was how soldiers felt before battle, this mixture of terror and determination that made your body move forward even when every instinct screamed to run away. They reached the basement of the garrison building at exactly 7:58, emerging from the tunnel into a storage room filled with filing cabinets and old furniture. The basement was dimly lit by a single electric bulb, and they could hear voices and footsteps on the floor above. German soldiers going about their duties, with no idea that enemies had just infiltrated their stronghold. Thomas positioned 2 fighters at the stairs to watch for guards while the rest of the team searched for the holding cells where prisoners were kept. Marie moved through the basement with growing desperation, opening doors and checking rooms, finding nothing but storage spaces and empty offices. The building was larger than she remembered, a maze of corridors and chambers that all looked identical in the weak light. Time was running out. The artillery barrage would begin in less than 2 minutes, and they still had not found her parents. Then she heard it, faint but unmistakable. Her mother's voice, singing a lullaby Marie had heard 1,000 times as a child. The sound came from behind a heavy wooden door at the end of the corridor, and Marie ran toward it with Thomas right behind her, their mission reaching its critical moment just as the first American artillery shell screamed overhead and detonated somewhere in the distance, signaling that their window of opportunity had finally opened. The door was locked with a heavy iron bolt, and Thomas worked on it with a pry bar while the building shook from artillery impacts that were getting progressively closer to their position. The American gunners were walking their fire across the German defensive line, each explosion slightly nearer than the last, creating the illusion of an advancing bombardment that would force the Germans to focus on external threats rather than internal security. Marie pressed her face against the door and called out to her parents, keeping her voice low but urgent, and she heard her father respond with confused recognition. He had not expected rescue, had resigned himself to execution, and the sudden appearance of his daughter in what should have been an impenetrable German stronghold must have seemed like a hallucination born of stress and fear. The bolt finally gave way with a metallic screech, and Thomas pulled the door open to reveal a small cell containing Marie's parents and 3 other prisoners, all of them blinking in the sudden light from the corridor. Her mother looked gaunt and terrified. Her father had bruises on his face from interrogation, but they were alive and mobile, which was all that mattered for the escape attempt. Getting 5 prisoners back through the tunnel while under time pressure and possible pursuit was exponentially more difficult than the infiltration had been. Marie's parents were in their 50s and not accustomed to physical exertion, and the other 3 prisoners were in even worse condition, showing signs of beatings and malnutrition. Thomas made rapid calculations and decided they could not take everyone, that attempting to evacuate all 5 prisoners would slow them down too much and guarantee capture. He gave the other 3 prisoners directions to Allied lines and told them to run as soon as the team created enough chaos to distract the guards. It was a brutal triage decision, prioritizing Marie's parents because they were the specific targets of the rescue operation, but it haunted everyone who participated in that mission. Those 3 prisoners would have to save themselves or die trying, and the resistance could offer them nothing beyond a slim chance and a prayer. Marie wanted to argue, wanted to insist they take everyone, but she understood the mathematics of survival and remained silent as the 3 condemned souls nodded their acceptance and prepared to run for their lives. The escape back through the tunnel became a nightmare of close calls and near disasters. Marie's mother struggled with the knee-deep water and had to be half-carried by 2 resistance fighters. Her father kept stumbling over debris in the darkness, and every delay increased the risk that German guards would discover the empty cell and sound the alarm. Above them, the artillery barrage continued to pound German positions, the explosions providing cover for the noise of their retreat, but also causing structural stress on the old tunnel. Bricks began falling from the ceiling, splashing into the water and creating hazards that threatened to trip or injure the fleeing group. Marie moved in a state of focused desperation, helping her mother when she faltered, urging her father forward when he wanted to rest, aware that every second they remained in that tunnel brought them closer to either capture or burial under tons of collapsed masonry. They were halfway through when they heard the alarm bells ringing in the garrison building behind them, a shrill metallic sound that meant the empty cell had been discovered and guards were now searching for the escaped prisoners. The last 100 yards of tunnel became a race against pursuit, with the resistance team abandoning any pretense of stealth and simply running through the water as fast as the prisoners could manage. They emerged into the warehouse at 8:23, 23 minutes after entering the tunnel, and Thomas immediately ordered his fighters to collapse the entrance behind them to prevent German soldiers from following. They used grenades to bring down the brick archway, sealing the tunnel in a cloud of dust and rubble that would take hours to clear. The explosion also served as a signal to other resistance members waiting outside, who created diversions throughout the railway yards to confuse any German response. Marie's parents were bundled into a waiting truck and covered with blankets and cargo, transformed instantly from prisoners to anonymous refugees. The entire rescue from the moment they entered the tunnel to the moment the truck pulled away from the warehouse had taken 28 minutes, and in that brief window, Marie had transformed from a fugitive hiding in fear to an active participant in her own salvation. She had not fired a weapon or killed anyone, but she had made choices and taken actions that directly opposed German authority, and there was no going back from that threshold. The truck carrying Marie and her parents drove through Mons using back streets and alleys, avoiding checkpoints and German patrols while heading toward the American-controlled sector of the city. The liberation was uneven and incomplete, with some neighborhoods firmly under Allied control, while others remained contested by German rearguard units. Marie sat between her parents in the back of the truck, holding their hands while trying to process everything that had happened in the past 3 weeks. She had saved a city by accident, had been hunted by the Gestapo for that accidental salvation, and had now participated in an armed rescue operation that made her an actual combatant rather than just a wanted suspect. Her life had been fractured into distinct phases, before the transposed coordinates during the hiding, and now after the rescue. Each phase had required different versions of herself, and she was no longer certain which version was the real Marie Lecomte. Her mother seemed to sense this internal struggle and squeezed her hand tightly, whispering that they were alive because of her courage, that nothing else mattered beyond that simple fact. But Marie knew it was more complicated than courage. That accident and intention had become so intertwined in her story that separating them was impossible. The truck reached American lines just before 9 o'clock, passing through a checkpoint manned by soldiers from the 2nd Armored Division, who were more concerned with German counterattacks than with verifying the identities of Belgian refugees. Marie and her parents were taken to a displaced persons camp on the western outskirts of Mons, a sprawling collection of tents and makeshift shelters that housed thousands of civilians who had been uprooted by the final stages of the liberation. The camp was chaos incarnate, a babel of languages and desperation, where people searched for missing family members, begged for food and medicine, and tried to piece together some understanding of what came next. American military police maintained order, but seemed overwhelmed by the sheer scale of human displacement they were witnessing. Marie registered under a false name, still paranoid that German agents might infiltrate the camp looking for her, and secured a tent for her parents in a section reserved for elderly refugees. The conditions were primitive but safe, which was all that mattered after weeks of terror and uncertainty. For the first time since September 9th, Marie allowed herself to believe that they might actually survive this war. But survival brought its own complications, because the German withdrawal from Belgium was not proceeding as smoothly as Allied commanders had anticipated. Pockets of resistance remained throughout the region, and some German units were fighting with the desperation of men who knew they had nothing to lose. The Gestapo continued to operate in areas they still controlled, conducting executions and reprisals against anyone suspected of aiding the Allied advance. On October 2nd, 3 days after Marie's rescue operation, the Gestapo executed 17 Belgian civilians in the town of Tournai on charges of sabotage and espionage. Among them were 2 telephone operators, women who had committed no crime beyond being in the wrong profession at the wrong time. Thomas brought this news to Marie at the displaced persons camp, and his message was clear. The hunt for the telephone operator who had sabotaged the Mons artillery strike was ongoing and would continue until either she was captured or the Germans were completely driven from Belgian territory. Marie's rescue of her parents had been a tactical victory, but had also confirmed to the Gestapo that she was still in the region, still alive, and still worth pursuing. The waiting became its own form of torture, more psychological than physical, but no less damaging. Marie spent her days helping American medical staff treat wounded civilians, using her language skills to translate between French-speaking patients and English-speaking doctors. The work kept her hands busy, but did nothing to quiet her mind, which raced constantly with scenarios of capture and execution. Every German-speaking voice in the camp sent waves of panic through her system. Every unexpected visitor to her family's tent triggered the instinct to run and hide. She was living in liberated territory surrounded by American soldiers, but she felt no safer than when she had been hiding in Marguerite's cellar. The psychological damage of prolonged fear was beginning to manifest in physical symptoms. She couldn't sleep more than 2 or 3 hours at a time. She had lost nearly 15 pounds because food tasted like ashes in her mouth, and her hands developed a tremor that made simple tasks difficult. Her mother watched this deterioration with growing alarm, but seemed powerless to stop it, understanding that no amount of comfort or reassurance could erase the fact that Marie's life was still in danger as long as any German forces remained in Belgium. The final German withdrawal from the Mons region occurred on October 7th, nearly a month after the failed artillery barrage that had started this entire nightmare. American forces pushed the last organized German units across the border into Germany proper, and the Gestapo agents who had been hunting Marie either retreated with them or went into hiding themselves. Thomas confirmed through resistance intelligence networks that the specific unit searching for her had withdrawn to Germany, and that the arrest warrant bearing her name was now functionally meaningless because no German authority remained in Belgium to enforce it. Marie was free, or as free as anyone could be in the immediate aftermath of occupation, but freedom felt anticlimactic and strangely empty after weeks of constant fear. She had imagined this moment would bring relief or joy, but instead she felt numb and disconnected, as if the person who had answered that telephone call on September 9th had been someone else entirely, someone who had died and been replaced by this exhausted shell. The American military began conducting formal interviews with Belgian civilians in mid-October, documenting war crimes and gathering intelligence about German operations during the occupation. An intelligence officer named Captain James Mitchell requested an interview with Marie specifically because American command had heard rumors about a telephone operator who had somehow prevented an artillery strike on Mons. The story had circulated through resistance networks and eventually reached Allied intelligence, but the details were confused and contradictory. Some versions claimed Marie had deliberately sabotaged the coordinates as an act of resistance. Others suggested divine intervention or German incompetence. Captain Mitchell wanted to know the truth, wanted to understand how a city that should have been reduced to rubble had instead been liberated virtually intact. Marie sat across from him in a tent that served as a temporary intelligence office and told her story for the first time in its complete and unedited form. She explained about the exhaustion, the double shift, the thick Bavarian accent crackling through old copper wires, and the simple transposition of numbers that had saved somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 lives. Captain Mitchell listened without interrupting, taking notes in a leather-bound journal, and when she finished, he asked the question that would define how history remembered this event. Did she believe her mistake had been an accident, or had some part of her subconscious deliberately sabotaged those coordinates because she knew what they meant? Marie thought about Captain Mitchell's question for a long time before answering, understanding that her response would shape not just the official record, but her own understanding of who she was and what she had done. She told him honestly that she did not know, that the human mind was not as simple as conscious intention versus pure accident, that exhaustion and stress could create states where the boundary between deliberate and unintentional action became impossibly blurred. She had been passing information to the resistance for over a year, had been actively looking for opportunities to disrupt German operations, and perhaps some part of her brain had recognized the catastrophic nature of those coordinates and had deliberately transposed them while her conscious mind remained unaware. Or perhaps it truly had been nothing more than a tired woman making a simple clerical error under pressure, with no hidden heroism or subconscious sabotage involved. Captain Mitchell seemed frustrated by this ambiguity, wanting a clear narrative for his report, but eventually accepted that some questions had no definitive answers. He classified her action as accidental with possible subconscious intent, a bureaucratic compromise that satisfied neither the demand for heroic narrative nor the simpler explanation of random chance. The psychological aftermath of the rescue and the final German withdrawal proved more difficult than the actual events themselves. Marie developed what military doctors at the time called battle fatigue, what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. She experienced vivid nightmares of artillery shells falling on Mons, of being captured and executed by the Gestapo, of her parents dying in that cell while she remained hidden at the farm. The nightmares were so intense that she began avoiding sleep entirely, staying awake for days at a time until exhaustion forced her into brief periods of unconsciousness filled with terrors. American medical staff provided what limited treatment they could, mostly sedatives and reassurances, that the symptoms would fade with time, but they had no real understanding of psychological trauma or effective treatments for it. Marie's mother tried to help by keeping her busy with reconstruction work, but the damage went too deep for simple distraction to heal. She had crossed too many thresholds, had become too many different versions of herself in too short a time, and integrating those fractured identities into a coherent whole seemed impossible. The city of Mons began its recovery during that autumn of 1944, and the contrast between the city's intact buildings and the ruins of other liberated cities became increasingly obvious. Visitors from Brussels or Liège would arrive and express shock at how little damage Mons had sustained, unable to understand why this particular city had been spared when so many others had been devastated. The official explanation, when there was one, attributed the preservation of Mons to rapid Allied advance and German disorganization during their retreat. Nobody mentioned the failed artillery barrage or the telephone operator who had transposed two numbers. The resistance leadership made a deliberate decision to keep Marie's story quiet, because publicizing it would require acknowledging that her previous year of actual sabotage work and that level of disclosure could still be dangerous, while collaborators and informants remained unidentified throughout Belgium. Marie understood this logic, but felt increasingly isolated by the secrecy, unable to share her experience with anyone beyond the small circle of resistance members who already knew. She existed in a strange limbo where she had saved thousands of lives but could not acknowledge that salvation publicly. Her parents reopened their bakery in November, returning to the routines of normal life with a determination that seemed almost defiant. They rarely spoke about their imprisonment or the rescue, treating those weeks as an aberration to be forgotten rather than processed. Marie envied their ability to compartmentalize trauma, to simply decide that survival was enough and move forward without dwelling on what might have been. But she could not achieve that same mental separation because her role in events had been more active and complex. She had made choices, had taken actions both accidental and deliberate, and those choices had created ripples that extended far beyond her personal survival. Every time she walked through Mons and saw children playing in streets that should have been cratered ruins, every time she passed the hospital that should have been obliterated or the school that should have been a mass grave, she felt the weight of those transposed numbers pressing down on her consciousness. It was not guilt exactly, because she had saved lives rather than taken them, but it was a burden nonetheless, the knowledge that a moment of exhaustion and error had determined whether thousands of people lived or died. By December, Marie had made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She was leaving Mons permanently and emigrating to England, where she had distant relatives. She could not continue living in the city she had saved, because every street corner was a reminder of what almost happened. Every familiar face was someone who would have died if she had written down different numbers. The weight of unacknowledged heroism was crushing her more effectively than German pursuit ever had, and she needed distance and anonymity to survive psychologically. Thomas tried to convince her to stay, arguing that Belgium would need people like her during the reconstruction, but he eventually understood that some wounds could not heal in the place where they were inflicted. Marie's parents were heartbroken but supportive, recognizing that their daughter had been fundamentally changed by her experience and needed to become someone new in a place where nobody knew her story. On December 15, 1944, Marie Lecomte boarded a military transport to England, carrying a small suitcase and a secret that she would keep for the next 40 years. Marie Lecomte lived in England for the rest of her life, settling in a small town outside London, where she worked as a translator and eventually married a British engineer who knew nothing about her wartime experiences. She had 3 children and 7 grandchildren, built a quiet and unremarkable life that was precisely what she needed after the chaos of 1944. She never returned to Mons, never attended reunions of resistance members, and never sought recognition for what she had done. The transposed coordinates remained her secret, shared only with her husband during a single conversation in 1963, when nightmares forced her to finally explain the source of her lingering trauma. He listened without judgment, and then promised never to speak of it again, understanding that some stories were too heavy to carry publicly. Marie seemed content with this arrangement, with being nobody special in a world that had forgotten the telephone operator who had accidentally saved a city. But in 1984, 40 years after the events in Mons, a Belgian historian researching the liberation discovered Captain Mitchell's intelligence report in American military archives and began investigating the story of the failed artillery barrage. The historian, a professor named Henri Dubois, spent 2 years tracking down surviving members of the resistance and piecing together what had actually happened on September 9, 1944. He found Thomas Rousseau, now elderly but still sharp, who confirmed the story and provided Marie's current location in England. Professor Dubois contacted Marie and requested an interview, explaining that her story deserved to be told as part of Belgium's wartime history. Marie initially refused, insisting that she had done nothing heroic and that elevating a simple mistake to the status of deliberate heroism would be dishonest. But Professor Dubois persisted, arguing that intentionality was irrelevant when measured against outcome, that 8,000 to 12,000 people had lived because of her exhaustion-induced error, and that their descendants now numbered in the tens of thousands. Marie was not just responsible for saving those who would have died in the bombardment. She had preserved entire family lines that would never have existed if those shells had fallen on their intended targets. The mathematics of her impact extended forward through generations, in ways that could never be fully calculated. In 1986, Marie finally agreed to return to Mons for a single day to participate in a small ceremony acknowledging her role in the city's preservation. She was 75 years old, frail and uncertain, and she made Professor Dubois promise that the event would be low-key and would not glorify her actions beyond their actual scope. The ceremony was held in the Grand Place, the same square that would have been destroyed if the artillery coordinates had been correct. Approximately 300 people attended, including surviving resistance members, city officials, and several families who had researched their genealogy and determined that their ancestors would have died in the bombardment. Marie stood on a small platform and gave a brief speech that lasted less than 3 minutes. She explained what had happened in simple terms, emphasizing the role of accident and circumstance rather than courage or intention. She thanked the resistance members who had saved her and her parents, acknowledged the lives that had been preserved through no merit of her own, and then asked that no monument or plaque be erected in her honor because she did not want to be remembered as a hero when she had simply been a tired woman who made a mistake. The city of Mons respected her wishes and erected no public monument, but private remembrance continued through oral histories and family stories passed down through generations. Children who had been in school on September 9, 1944, told their grandchildren about the shells that never fell. Survivors of the occupation explained to younger relatives how close they had come to annihilation and how a telephone operator's error had given them the chance to live full lives. Marie returned to England after that single day and lived for another 7 years, dying peacefully in 1993 at age 82. Her obituary in British newspapers made no mention of Mons or artillery strikes, describing her only as a translator and devoted mother. But in Belgium, particularly in Mons, her death was noted with quiet reverence by those who understood what she had done. The generation that had lived through the occupation was mostly gone by then, but their children and grandchildren carried forward the story of the woman who had saved a city by being too tired to write down numbers correctly. The deeper truth about Marie's story, the reason it matters beyond the specific circumstances of World War II, is what it reveals about heroism and accident, about how history pivots on moments so small they seem insignificant until their consequences unfold. Marie Leconte never wanted to be a hero, never sought recognition or reward, and spent most of her life trying to forget the weight of what she had done. But 8 to 12,000 people survived September 9th, 1944, because she transposed 2 numbers in a telephone call. Their children were born, their grandchildren exist, their great-grandchildren walk the streets of Mons today, all because of 3 seconds of exhausted confusion in a cramped telephone exchange room. The story was never recorded in major history books, never taught in schools, never commemorated with statues or national holidays. It remains one of those footnotes that occasionally surfaces in specialized research or local histories, a reminder that the most profound acts of salvation often come not from deliberate heroism, but from the random intersection of human fallibility and historical consequence. Marie's legacy is not fame or recognition, but simple existence, the continuation of thousands of family lines that would have ended if she had been more alert, more careful, more accurate in that single moment when the world balanced on the edge of 2 transposed numbers.